Sometimes, when life breaks you down to nothing, you discover what really matters. Jack Carter knew that feeling well as he stood at a county auction with 20 cents in his pocket, the last money he had after losing everything in a bitter divorce. Everyone laughed when he bid on the old barn. It was falling apart, worthless, ready to collapse. But Jack wasn't thinking about money anymore. He was thinking about his 6-year-old son Toby and maybe giving him one place that felt like theirs. That barn was hiding something nobody expected. When little Toby started exploring, crawling into dark corners and pulling up loose floorboards, he found a secret room underneath. Inside were letters and photographs from World War II, left by people who used this place to save lives. What Toby discovered would change their lives forever. But what happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The auction house still smelled of stale coffee and old dreams when Jack Carter walked out into the October evening, clutching a crumpled receipt for 20 cents. Around him, other bidders loaded their purchases: antique furniture, farming, equipment, boxes of china that caught the last rays of sunlight. Jack had nothing to show for his bid except a rusted key and directions to a barn that nobody else wanted. His pickup truck coughed to life on the third try, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past 8 months. The engine knock had gotten worse since Sarah filed for divorce, but there wasn't money for repairs. There wasn't money for much of anything these days. Construction work had dried up when the housing market stumbled, and his savings had evaporated, faster than morning dew under an August sun. The drive back to Millfield took him through the heart of rural Oklahoma, past farmhouses that had weathered decades of hard seasons. Some stood proud with fresh paint and well-tended gardens. Others leaned into the wind like old men carrying too much weight, their windows dark and their fields returning to prairie grass. Jack understood both kinds of houses. He'd built some and watched others fall. Toby was waiting on the front steps of their single-wide trailer when Jack pulled into the gravel driveway. The boy had his wooden toy truck in his hands, the one Jack had carved for him last Christmas when there wasn't money for store-bought toys. Even at 6 years old, Toby seemed to understand that hand-carved meant more love than plastic ever did. "You buy something, Daddy?" Toby asked, his eyes bright with the kind of hope that children carry until the world teaches them otherwise. Jack knelt down beside his son, feeling the weight of the day in his knees. "I did, buddy. I bought us a barn." "Real barn? With animals?" "Not yet," Jack said, smoothing down Toby's cowlick with gentle fingers. "But maybe someday. It's going to need some work first." The boy's smile could have powered the whole trailer park. "Can we go see it?" "Tomorrow," Jack promised. After breakfast, inside their narrow home, Jack heated up a can of soup, while Toby played on the worn carpet, pushing his wooden truck around an imaginary highway system. The trailer felt smaller every day, its thin walls unable to contain a growing boy's energy or a grown man's worries. But it was theirs, at least until the next rent payment came due. Mrs. Henderson knocked on their door just as they were sitting down to eat. She was 78 years old and had lived in the trailer park longer than anyone could remember. Her arthritis had been acting up again, and Jack had been helping her with groceries and small repairs around her place. She never asked for help directly. That wasn't her way. But she'd show up with extra portions of whatever she'd cooked, claiming she'd made too much for one person. "Brought you boys some cornbread," she said, setting a covered plate on their small table. "Heard you were at the Peterson auction today." "Yes, ma'am." Jack cut the cornbread into thick slices, the steam rising like prayers in the cool evening air. "Bought myself an old barn out on County Road 47. Mrs. Henderson's eyes sharpened with interest. "That wouldn't be the old Muller place, would it?" "I don't know whose place it was. Auctioneer just called it Lot 23. Been empty for years," she said, settling into the third chair at their table. My daddy used to know the family that owned that land. Foreign folks came here right before the war. Kept to themselves mostly, but they were good people. Toby looked up from his soup. What kind of war? The big one, Mrs. Henderson said gently. World War II. Before your daddy was even born. Jack found himself leaning forward. What happened? To them, the family that owned the barn, disappeared one day, just up and left everything behind. Nobody ever knew why. Mrs. Henderson's weathered hands wrapped around her coffee mug. Course, that was a long time ago. Probably nothing left there now but memories and dust. After Mrs. Henderson went home, Jack tucked Toby into his narrow bed and read him a story about brave knights and hidden treasures. The boy fell asleep, clutching his wooden truck, his breathing soft and steady in the trailer's quiet darkness. Jack stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching his son sleep and thinking about the barn that now belonged to them. 20 cents. That's what it had taken to buy a piece of hope. He pulled out the papers from the auction, studying them by the light of the kitchen lamp. The barn sat on 2 acres of land, according to the deed. The taxes were paid up through the end of the year, a small miracle in itself. The previous owner had died with no family, and the county had been trying to sell the property for months. Before dropping the price to almost nothing, Jack's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Toby's school called about his field trip money. $15 due Monday. $15, 3/4 of what Jack had left in his wallet until the next. Unemployment check came in, but Toby would go on that field trip, even if Jack had to skip meals to make it happen. Some things mattered more than a full stomach. He walked outside onto the small wooden deck that someone had built as an addition to the trailer. The night air carried the scent of grass and distant rain. Above him, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt, the same stars that had looked down on this land when the Muller family lived here, when they worked that barn and kept their mysterious secrets. Jack thought about his own grandfather, who had died when Jack was still young. The old man had been a quiet soul who never talked much about his past, who carried himself with the dignity of someone who had seen difficult times and survived them. Jack wished now that he had asked more questions, learned more about the family. History that seemed to disappear with each generation. The construction business had been good to Jack for 15 years. He'd built homes for young families, renovated kitchens for empty nesters, and repaired storm damage after the tornadoes that swept through every spring. His hands knew the weight of tools and the satisfaction of creating something solid and lasting. But the divorce had changed everything. Sarah had taken half of everything they'd built together, and the legal fees had consumed most of what remained. Now here he was, 38 years old and starting over with 20 cents and a barn that everybody else considered worthless. Maybe they were right. Maybe he'd just thrown away the last of his money on a pile of rotting wood and rusted metal. But as he stood under the Oklahoma sky, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a quiet sense of possibility. Tomorrow he and Toby would drive out to County Road 47 and see what they had bought. Maybe it would be a disaster. Maybe the roof would cave in the moment they opened the door, but it would be theirs. And sometimes that was enough to build a future on. The phone buzzed again. Another text from Sarah. Jack, we need to talk about Toby's future. This can't go on. He turned off the phone without responding. Sarah had made her choices, and now he was making his. The barn might not be much, but it was a start. And sometimes, Jack thought as he headed back inside, a start was all a man needed to find his way home. In the morning, they would begin again. Saturday morning came, with the kind of crisp October air that made everything seem possible. Toby bounced in his booster seat as Jack's pickup truck navigated the dirt roads leading to County Road 47, chattering about all the animals they might find in their barn. Maybe there's horses, Daddy, or cows. Do you think there's cows? I don't know, buddy. We'll have to wait and see. The barn appeared around a bend in the road like something from a faded photograph. It stood alone in a field. of tall grass, its weathered grey wood silvered by decades of sun and rain. The roof sagged in places, and several boards hung loose from the sides, but the structure had a stubborn dignity that spoke of good craftsmanship and solid bones. Jack parked the truck, and they walked through the knee-high grass together, Toby's small hand warm in his father's larger one. Up close, the barn was bigger than it had looked from the road, maybe 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a traditional gambrel roof and a wide double door that hung slightly askew on its hinges. "It looks sleepy," Toby observed, tilting his head to study the building. "Maybe we can wake it up," Jack said, fishing the rusty key from his pocket. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting patiently for someone to come home. The doors groaned as Jack pulled them open, revealing the barn's dim interior. Shafts of sunlight slanted through gaps in the boards, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the still air. The space was larger than Jack had expected, with a high ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. Ancient hay bales sat stacked in one corner, their twine rotted away and their contents scattered across the floor. Farm tools hung from hooks along the walls, pitchforks, scythes, and harnesses that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. "Wow," Toby whispered, his voice echoing in the empty space. "It's like a castle." While Jack examined the structural integrity of the walls and roof, Toby began his own exploration. The boy had always been curious, the kind of child who looked under rocks and opened every door, driven by an insatiable need to understand how things worked. He found a wooden ladder leading to a hayloft and scrambled up before Jack could stop him. "I can see everything from up here," Toby called down, his voice filled with wonder. "Be careful up there," Jack warned, but he was smiling. His son's joy was infectious, and for the first time in months, Jack felt some of his worry lift from his shoulders. The boy disappeared from view, and Jack heard the sound of small feet moving across the loft floor. Boards creaked overhead as Toby explored corners that hadn't seen visitors in years. Then came a different sound, a hollow thump, as if something had given way beneath his weight. "Daddy!" Toby's voice held excitement rather than fear. "There's something weird up here." Jack climbed the ladder quickly, his construction-trained eye already assessing the loft's condition. Toby was kneeling beside a section of floorboards that had partially collapsed, revealing a dark space beneath. "I didn't break it on purpose," Toby said quickly. "It just fell when I stepped on it." Jack knelt beside his son and examined the opening. The boards were old and had rotted around the nails, but the break looked almost deliberate, as if these particular boards had been designed to lift away. He pulled out his phone and used its flashlight to peer into the space below. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't just empty space beneath the floorboards. Someone had built a small room down there, maybe 8 feet square, with its own wooden walls and floor. And that room wasn't empty. Wooden crates lined the walls, and shelves held rows of glass jars and metal containers. In the center of the space, a small table held what looked like papers and photographs, everything covered with a fine layer of dust, but remarkably well preserved. "What is it, Daddy?" Toby asked, pressing close to peer into the hidden room. "I'm not sure yet," Jack said, though his mind was already racing. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create this secret space and fill it with carefully preserved items. This wasn't random storage. This was intentional, purposeful hiding. Jack tested the remaining floorboards carefully before lowering himself into the hidden room. The ceiling was just tall enough for him to stand upright. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he began to make out details that made his heart race. The papers on the table were letters, dozens of them, written in careful handwriting and organized into neat stacks. Some were in English, others in what looked like German. Photographs were scattered among the letters, black and white images of people and places from what appeared to be the 1940s. One photograph in particular caught his attention. It showed a young couple standing in front of the very barn where he now stood. But the building looked new and well-maintained in the picture. On the back, someone had written, "Heinrich and Greta, 1943, in fading ink." "Toby!" Jack called up to his son, who was peering down through the opening. "I need you to stay up there for a minute while I look at these things, okay? Some of them might be fragile. Are they treasure?" Jack picked up one of the letters and carefully unfolded it. The paper was yellowed but intact, and the handwriting was clear and precise. It was dated August 15th, 1943, and began with, "My dearest Heinrich." "I think they might be," Jack said softly, his voice filled with wonder. As he read, the story began to unfold. These weren't just old letters. They were communications between people involved in something dangerous and important, references to packages and safe passage, and the next station filled the pages. Names and dates and coded messages that spoke of a network of people working together towards some common cause. One letter contained a hand-drawn map showing roads and landmarks, with the barn marked clearly as Station 7. Another included a list of supplies needed: blankets, food, medical supplies, and warm clothing. Jack felt like an archaeologist who had stumbled upon an intact tomb. These documents were a window into a hidden piece of history, preserved by accident in this forgotten corner of Oklahoma farmland. "Daddy, can I come down now?" Toby asked impatiently. "Just another minute," Jack said. But he was already planning how to safely extract these materials. Whatever story these letters told, it was important enough for someone to hide them carefully and preserve them through decades of neglect. He found more photographs tucked between the pages of a leather-bound journal. Pictures of families, of children, of people who looked tired but hopeful. And then he found one that made his blood run cold, a photograph of men in uniform with insignia he recognized from history books. This wasn't just any hiding place. This was a cache of materials from World War II, and judging by the contents, Heinrich and Greta Müller hadn't been ordinary farmers. They'd been part of something much larger and more dangerous, something that had required them to build secret rooms and hide their activities from the world. Jack carefully replaced the photograph and looked around the small space with new eyes. These people had risked everything to help others, using this barn as a station in what appeared to be an underground network, and now, 75 years later, their story was waiting to be told. "Okay, buddy," he called to Toby. "I'm coming. Back up. We need to go home and figure out what we found here." As Jack climbed out of the hidden room, his mind was already racing ahead to questions and possibilities. Who had Heinrich and Greta been? What had happened to them? And why had their secret remained hidden for so many decades? Looking at his son's excited face, Jack realized that their 20-cent purchase had just become something much more valuable and complex than a simple shelter. They had bought themselves a piece of history, and with it, a responsibility that felt both thrilling and overwhelming. The photograph of Heinrich and Greta seemed to watch them as they prepared to leave. Two young faces frozen in time, waiting for someone to finally tell their story. Back at the trailer, Jack spread towels across their small kitchen table and carefully arranged the items they'd brought from the hidden room. Toby sat beside him, his wooden truck forgotten, as he watched his father handle each piece with the reverence of someone touching sacred relics. The leather-bound journal had caught Jack's attention first. Its cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and the brass clasp still worked despite decades of neglect. Inside, page after page of careful handwriting documented what appeared to be an intricate operation. Heinrich Müller, Station 7 operations. Log read the first page, followed by entries that began in early 1942 and continued through the summer of 1945. Jack read aloud, his voice soft in the trailer's cramped space. March 15th, 1942. First group arrived safely. 3 adults, 2 children. Greta prepared extra bedding in the barn loft. Weather clear for travel to Station 12. "What's Station 12, Daddy?" Toby asked, his 6-year-old mind trying to make sense of the mysterious entries. "I think it was like a stopping point," Jack explained, though he was still piecing together the bigger picture himself. Like when we drive to Grandma's house and stop for gas along the way. But these weren't pleasure trips. As Jack continued reading, the journal revealed a network of people helping others escape from danger. References to packages that needed safe passage and secure transport painted a picture of desperate journeys across hostile territory. One entry made Jack's breath catch. April 3rd, 1943. Package includes elderly man, speaks no English. Wife separated at checkpoint in Missouri. He carries photograph of grandchildren. Greta cried when she saw it. We must remember why we do this work. Jack looked up at Toby, who was carefully examining one of the photographs they'd found. These people were helping families stay together during the war, he said quietly. Like you helped Mrs. Henderson with her groceries? Something like that, buddy, but much more dangerous. Jack's phone rang, interrupting his study of the journal. Sarah's name appeared on the screen and he hesitated before answering. Jack, we need to talk, she said without preamble. Toby's school called about his field trip money and I had to pay it. Again, this can't keep happening. I have the money, Jack said, though $15 would leave him with almost nothing until his unemployment check arrived. Where? You couldn't even afford Toby's school clothes last month. I had to buy them. Jack looked at the historical documents spread across his table, then at his son's eager face. Things are going to change, Sarah. I bought some property yesterday, and property with what money? Jack, you can't keep living in fantasy land. Toby needs stability, not another one of your get-rich-quick schemes. This isn't a scheme, Jack said, his voice steady despite the familiar sting of her disapproval. I found something important out there. Historical documents that could be valuable. Sarah's laugh held no humor. Historical documents? In Oklahoma? Jack, listen to yourself. You bought a broken-down barn with your last 20 cents, and now you think you've found treasure. After she hung up, Jack sat in silence for a long moment. Toby had moved to the floor and was building roads for his wooden truck, humming softly to himself. The boy seemed unaware of the tension in his father's voice, focused entirely on his imaginary world, where trucks could travel anywhere and every road led somewhere good. Jack returned to the journal, finding comfort in Heinrich Müller's careful documentation. Here was a man who had faced real problems, life and death situations, and had responded with courage and careful planning. Each entry revealed more about the network's operations and the risks they took to help strangers. May 17th, 1943, close call today. Sheriff's deputy stopped by asking about strangers in the area. Greta served him coffee and apple pie while I moved the packages to the root cellar. He complimented her baking and left without searching. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight. Jack found himself admiring Heinrich's ingenuity and calm under pressure. The man had built not just a hidden room, but an entire system for helping people disappear and reappear safely hundreds of miles away. A knock at the trailer door interrupted his reading. Mrs. Henderson stood on the small porch, holding a casserole dish, and wearing the expression she got when she had something important to discuss. Brought you boys some tuna noodle casserole, she said, though her eyes immediately went to the materials spread across the table. What have you got there? Jack hesitated, then decided to trust her. We found these in the barn, hidden under the floorboards. Mrs. Henderson set down the casserole and picked up the photograph of Heinrich and Greta. Her weathered fingers traced their young faces, and something shifted in her expression. My lord, she whispered, it's really them. You recognize them, Heinrich and Greta Müller. I was just a girl then, maybe 8 or 9 years old, but I remember them coming to town for supplies, always polite, always paid in cash. My daddy said they were good people who kept to themselves. She picked up the journal and read a few entries, her eyes growing wide. I never knew, she said softly, all those years, and I never knew what they were really doing out there. What do you remember about them? Jack asked, leaning forward. They disappeared one day in late 1945, just gone, like they'd never been there at all. The barn stood empty for years afterward. Folks said they'd probably gone back to Germany after the war ended. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. But this changes everything. She continued reading, occasionally making soft sounds of amazement. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an entry dated September 1944. They helped a family with 2 small children get to Canada. The mother was pregnant and couldn't travel fast. Heinrich and Greta kept them for 3 weeks until she was strong. Enough to continue. Toby looked up from his trucks. Were they hiding from the bad guys? "Yes, sweetie," Mrs. Henderson said gently. "Heinrich and Greta helped people hide from very bad men during the war." "Like heroes?" "Exactly like heroes. Quiet heroes who never got famous for what they did." Jack felt a growing sense of responsibility as he read more entries. These documents weren't just historical curiosities. They were testimony to courage and sacrifice that had never been properly recognized. Heinrich and Greta had risked their lives repeatedly to help strangers, and their story had been forgotten. "Mrs. Henderson," Jack said slowly, "do you think there might be other people around here who remember the Mullers? People who might know. What happened to them? Might be. Dr. Margaret Ellis, over at the County Historical Society, she's been collecting old stories for years, and there's a few folks my age who might remember things their parents told them." Mrs. Henderson looked at the journal again. "Jack, this is important. This is the kind of history that should be preserved." As the evening wore on, Jack continued reading while Toby played quietly nearby. The journal revealed that Heinrich and Greta weren't working alone. They were part of a larger network that stretched across several states. Station 7 was one stop in a carefully coordinated system that had helped hundreds of people reach safety. The final entries in the journal were dated August 1945, just after the war ended. Heinrich wrote about the uncertainty they faced now that their mission was complete. Some of the families they'd helped were trying to rebuild their lives in America. Others were searching for relatives they'd lost during the war. The last entry was dated August 30th, 1945. "Greta and I have decided to move on. Too many people know our faces now, and some still bear grudges against those who helped the refugees. We've prepared everything in the barn for whoever comes after us. Perhaps someday someone will find these records and understand what we tried to do here. The packages we helped move weren't just people, they were hope itself, carried from one safe harbor to another." Jack closed the journal and looked around his small trailer, seeing it with new eyes. He and Toby weren't just poor anymore. They were the inheritors of a legacy of courage and compassion that stretched back 75 years. The 20-cent barn had connected them to something much larger than their own struggles. Outside, the October night was growing cold, but inside their modest home, father and son sat surrounded by proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose to help others rather than themselves. Dr. Margaret Ellis arrived at the trailer park on Sunday morning in a sensible sedan that looked like it had carried her to 1,000 historical sites over the past decade. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that lit up at the mention of undiscovered history. Jack had called her after finding her number in the phone book, and she'd driven the 40 miles from the county seat without hesitation. Now she sat at his kitchen table, wearing white cotton gloves as she examined the documents with the care of a surgeon handling delicate tissue. "This is remarkable," she murmured, photographing each page of Heinrich's journal with a professional camera. "I've been researching wartime activities in this region for 15 years, and I've never found anything this detailed." Toby watched from his spot on the floor, fascinated by the way Dr. Ellis handled each item as if it might crumble at her touch. She'd brought a magnifying glass and used it to examine the handwriting, the paper quality, and even the ink that Heinrich had used. The journal entries match historical records from other Underground Railway operations, she explained to Jack. The dates, the terminology, even the operational security measures, it all fits the pattern of organized refugee assistance networks that operated during the war. She unfolded the hand-drawn map they'd found among the documents. It was incredibly detailed, showing not just roads and landmarks, but also safe houses, checkpoints to avoid, and alternate routes for emergencies. Station 7, Heinrich and Greta's barn, was marked clearly in the center with routes leading north to Kansas and east toward Arkansas. "Look at this," Dr. Ellis said, pointing to small notations along the routes. "These are travel times between stations, rest stops, even places where they could get medical help if needed. This wasn't amateur work, this was a sophisticated operation." Jack studied the map more carefully. "How many people do you think they helped?" "Based on the journal entries I've read so far, at least 200 individuals passed through Station 7 between 1942 and 1945. Probably more." Dr. Ellis shook her head in amazement. "And this was just one station in a network that covered half the continent." She showed Jack how to identify different handwriting styles in the documents, pointing out that Greta had written many of the entries while Heinrich was away on what the journal referred to as supply runs. Greta Müller was clearly educated, Dr. Ellis observed. Her writing shows knowledge of geography, basic medicine, and what appears to be at least 3 languages. These weren't simple farmers. They were sophisticated people who chose to use their skills to help others. Among the photographs, they found images that told the story of the network's operations, pictures of families gathered around the barn's table, sharing meals before continuing their journeys, children playing in the grass while adults discussed routes and timing. And always, Heinrich and Greta in the background, watching over their temporary guests with the protective care of parents. One photograph showed a young woman holding a baby, standing beside the barn with Heinrich. On the back, Greta had written, "Maria and little Peter, safe passage to Station 12. May God bless their journey." Each of these families had a story, Dr. Ellis said softly. They left behind everything they'd ever known, carrying nothing but hope and the promise that strangers would help them find safety. Jack felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders. These weren't just historical documents, they were testimonies to acts of courage that had never been properly acknowledged. "What should we do with all this?" he asked. "First, we need to preserve everything properly," Dr. Ellis said. "These materials need to be stored in climate-controlled conditions to prevent further deterioration. Then, we need to verify their authenticity and research the people mentioned in the documents." She paused, studying Jack's face. "But ultimately, the decision of what to do with them belongs to you. You own the property where they were found." Jack thought about Sarah's dismissive laughter, about the bills stacking up on his counter, about Toby's school clothes that his ex-wife had to buy because he couldn't afford them. These documents might be historically valuable, but they wouldn't pay his rent or put food on his table. As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Ellis said gently, "Jack, I want you to know that materials like this can have significant monetary value. Museums, universities, private collectors, there would be considerable interest in acquiring these items." "How much?" Jack asked, though the question felt somehow wrong in the context of Heinrich and Greta's sacrifices. "It's impossible to say. Without a formal appraisal, but potentially tens of thousands of dollars. Maybe more, depending on what else you find in that barn." Jack looked at Toby, who was building elaborate road systems for his wooden truck. The boy seemed oblivious to the adult conversation about money and historical significance, focused entirely on his play. But Jack knew that every decision he made now would affect his son's future. "There's something else," Dr. Ellis said, pulling out a folder from her bag. "I brought copies of some documents from our archives, newspaper clippings, government records, that sort of thing. I thought you might want to see what else was happening in this area during the war." The newspaper clippings painted a picture of a community divided by fear and suspicion. Headlines spoke of enemy aliens and saboteurs, while editorial columns debated the loyalty of German immigrants. Several articles mentioned investigations into suspicious activities in rural areas, and one specifically referenced reports of unusual traffic near the Mueller farm. They were operating under constant threat of exposure, Dr. Ellis explained. The FBI was actively investigating suspected underground networks, and local law enforcement was on high alert for any signs of subversive activity. Jack found a police report dated October 1944 that made his blood run cold. It described a raid on a farm in the neighboring county, where authorities had arrested a family for harboring enemy aliens. The charges were later dropped, but not before the family had lost their property and been driven from the community. Heinrich and Greta knew this could happen to them, Jack said, understanding the true scope of their courage. Yet they continued their work for another year after this incident, Dr. Ellis pointed out. That takes remarkable dedication to a cause larger than their own safety. As afternoon faded into evening, Dr. Ellis helped Jack create a preliminary inventory of everything they'd found. 47 letters, 33 photographs, the detailed map, Heinrich's operational journal, and several smaller items including what appeared to be coded messages and supply lists. "This is just what was in the hidden room under the loft," she reminded him. "There might be more materials elsewhere in the barn." Underground networks often created multiple hiding places as insurance against discovery. After Dr. Ellis left, Jack sat at his table, staring at the carefully organized documents. Each item represented real people who had trusted Heinrich and Greta with their lives. Families who had eaten at this very table, children who had played in the grass outside the barn, elderly people who had found rest and safety in the Mueller's care. Mrs. Henderson knocked softly on the door as Jack was preparing Toby's dinner. She carried a plate of cookies and wore the expression of someone who had been thinking hard about old memories. "I've been making some phone calls," she said, settling into her usual chair. "Talked to my cousin Ruth, who's 86 and sharp as a tack. She remembers the Muellers better than I do." "What did she say?" "Ruth's family used to sell them supplies, flour, sugar, medical supplies, that sort of thing. Always paid cash, always bought more than two people could use. Her daddy wondered about it, but never asked questions." Mrs. Henderson paused to accept a cookie from Toby. "But she remembers something else. The Muellers had visitors. Not often, but regular-like. People who came at night and left before dawn." Jack felt his pulse quicken. Did she know who they were? Strangers. Different folks each time, but always the same pattern. Ruth's bedroom window looked out toward the Mueller. In place, and she used to watch for their signal, a lantern in the barn window that meant it was safe to approach. As Jack tucked Toby into bed that night, his son asked the question that had been building all day. "Daddy, are we going to be famous like Heinrich and Greta?" "They weren't famous, buddy. That's what made them special. They helped people without anyone knowing about it. But now we know," Toby said thoughtfully. "So we have to tell their story, right?" Jack smiled, struck by his son's simple wisdom. "Yeah, I think we do." Outside, the October wind rattled the trailer's thin walls, but Jack felt a new sense of purpose settling in his chest. They might not have much money, and Sarah might think he was chasing impossible dreams, but he and Toby were now the guardians of something precious, a story of ordinary people who had chosen to do extraordinary good in a dark time. Tomorrow, they would return to the barn and search for more pieces of Heinrich and Greta's legacy. And whatever they found, Jack was determined to make sure their story was finally told. Monday morning brought unseasonably warm weather and Dr. Ellis's return, this time with a graduate student named Marcus and several pieces of electronic equipment that looked more suited to a laboratory than a barn. They'd come to search for additional hiding places and to examine items too fragile to move. "Ground-penetrating radar," Dr. Ellis explained, as Marcus assembled a device that resembled a lawnmower with a computer screen attached. "If Heinrich and Greta created other hiding places, this should help us locate them without damaging the structure." Jack watched the screen as Marcus slowly pushed the device across the barn floor. patterns emerged in the subsurface scan. Pipes from a long-ago irrigation system, the stone foundation, and what appeared to be another void space near the barn's western wall. "There," Marcus said, pointing to an anomaly on the screen. "Something hollow about 4 feet down." They found the entrance hidden beneath a heavy wooden workbench that took all 3 men to move. Underneath, loose floorboards revealed a second chamber, this one larger than the first, and containing items that made Dr. Ellis gasp in amazement. Old reel-to-reel recording equipment sat in the corner, along with boxes of magnetic tape carefully sealed in waxed containers. Heinrich had apparently documented more than just written records of the network's operations. He'd recorded actual voices. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Ellis whispered as she examined the equipment. "Audio testimony from refugees during the war itself, not memories recorded decades later." It took them most of the afternoon to carefully extract the recording equipment and transport it to Dr. Ellis's office, where they had the proper facilities to play the fragile tapes without damaging them. Toby stayed close to Jack throughout the process, his 6-year-old solemnity suggesting he understood they were handling something sacred. The first tape they played contained Heinrich's voice, speaking in accented but careful English. "This is Heinrich Müller, Station 7, recording testimony for the historical record. Today is June 15th, 1943. With me is Mrs. Rachel Goldman, age 67, traveling with her grandson David, age 12. Mrs. Goldman, please tell us where you came from and where you're going." What followed was a story that brought tears to Dr. Ellis's eyes. Rachel Goldman described fleeing her home in Missouri after her son was arrested on false charges of espionage. She and 12-year-old David had walked for 3 weeks to reach Station 7, following a network of contacts who passed them from one safe house to another. "We had nothing," her voice said across the decades, speaking with the measured dignity of someone who had lost everything material, but retained her humanity. "But Mr. and Mrs. Muller, they gave us hope. They said America was still America, that there were people who remembered what this country was supposed to be." Young David's voice appeared on the tape too, shy but determined. "I want to be a teacher when I grow up. Heinrich, Mr. Muller, he showed me maps and taught me about geography. He said education was something nobody could ever take away from you." Jack found himself gripping Toby's hand as they listened. These weren't just historical records. They were intimate glimpses into lives interrupted by hatred and restored by compassion. The second tape contained multiple voices, what appeared to be a group recording session. Families sharing their stories, their fears, and their gratitude for finding safety at Station 7. Children's laughter could be heard in the background, along with Greta's voice directing someone to "Please eat more soup, you're too thin." "This changes everything we know about wartime refugee assistance," Dr. Ellis said, her professional composure cracking with emotion. These people weren't just statistics. They were individuals with names and dreams and hopes for the future. One voice on the tape made Jack sit up straighter. An elderly man spoke with a slight accent, describing his journey from a detention center in Texas. "My name is Friedrich Carter. I came to America in 1924, became citizen in 1930. But after Pearl Harbor, they said I was enemy alien because I was born in Germany. They took my farm, put me in camp for 2 years before I could prove my loyalty." Jack's blood ran cold. Carter was his surname, inherited from his grandfather who had died when Jack was young. His grandfather, who had never talked much about his past, who had carried himself with quiet dignity and an immigrant's careful patriotism. "Did he say Carter?" Toby asked, looking up at his father with wide eyes. Dr. Ellis rewound the tape and played it again. There was no mistake. Friedrich Carter, detained as an enemy alien, helped by Heinrich and Greta to reach safety somewhere in the north. "Jack," Dr. Ellis said gently, "do you know anything about your grandfather's background?" "Not much. He died when I was 8. My dad said he came from Germany before the war, but he never talked about it." Jack's voice was barely above a whisper. His name was Fred Carter. Friedrich Carter. The implications settled over them like dust in the barn's dim light. Jack's own grandfather had been one of the refugees Heinrich and Greta had helped. The 20-cent barn wasn't just a random purchase. It was a homecoming to a place where his family's story had intersected with history. They continued listening to the tapes as evening approached. Story after story of families torn apart by suspicion and reunited by courage. Heinrich's voice appeared regularly, asking careful questions and providing context for future listeners. He seemed to understand that these recordings might be the only lasting testimony to the network's work. One tape contained what appeared to be a planning session. Heinrich and several other men discussed routes, safe houses, and the increasing danger of discovery. "The FBI raided Station 3 last week," one voice reported. "The Kowalskis were arrested, but they released no information before we could relocate them." "We must be more careful," Heinrich replied. "Change the signals. Vary the routes. Too many. People depend on us to risk exposure through carelessness." As they packed up the equipment for the day, Dr. Ellis pulled Jack aside. "I need to ask you something difficult. Have you considered what you want to do with all this material long-term?" Jack looked at Toby, who was carefully carrying a small box of photographs. "What do you mean? These recordings, the documents, the photographs, they belong in a museum where scholars can study them and the public can learn from them. But they also represent significant monetary value." She paused. "I've already had inquiries from 3 universities and a private collector who's willing to make an immediate offer." "How much?" "The collector is offering $50,000 for the complete collection, sight unseen. The universities would likely offer less initially, but there could be ongoing royalties from research and publications. $50,000. Enough to pay off his debts, move into a real house, give Toby the stability that Sarah kept demanding. Enough to start over properly instead of living hand-to-mouth in a trailer park." But as Jack looked around the barn where his grandfather had once found safety, where Heinrich and Greta had risked everything to help strangers, the decision felt more complicated than simple mathematics. That evening, after Dr. Ellis and Marcus had left, Jack and Toby sat on the barn's front step, sharing sandwiches and watching the sunset over the Oklahoma prairie. The wind carried the scent of grass and distant rain, the same smells that Friedrich Carter would have encountered when he first arrived at Station 7 75 years ago. "Daddy," Toby said thoughtfully, "if Great-Grandpa Fred was here, what do you think he would want us to do?" Jack considered the question seriously. His grandfather had been a quiet man who valued hard work and simple integrity. He'd rebuilt his life after losing everything, but he'd never spoken bitterly about his experiences. Instead, he'd focused on building something better for his family. "I think," Jack said slowly, "he'd want people to remember what Heinrich and Greta did. Not for money, but because their story matters." Toby nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to his 6-year-old understanding of right and wrong. "Like how you always tell me the stories about when you were little, so I remember them too." "Exactly like that, buddy." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jack felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring more recordings, more discoveries, and more difficult choices about how to honor the legacy he and Toby had inherited, along with a 20-cent barn. The silver locket was tucked between the pages of Greta's recipe book, discovered on Tuesday morning when Dr. Ellis returned with a team of preservation specialists. The book itself was a treasure, handwritten recipes in German and English, with notes about feeding large groups and stretching limited supplies. But it was the small piece of jewelry pressed between pages of bread recipes that stopped everyone cold. Inside the locket was a photograph of a young man in work clothes, standing beside what appeared to be a construction site. The image was barely an inch square, but the face was unmistakably familiar to Jack. It was his grandfather as a young man, decades before Jack had known him. "My God," Mrs. Henderson whispered when Jack showed her the locket later that afternoon. "That's Fred Carter, all right. I'd know that stubborn jaw anywhere." They were sitting in her trailer, where she'd been going through a shoebox of old photographs at Jack's request. Now she pulled out a picture of her own, a group photo from a church social in 1950, where Jack's grandfather appeared among the crowd. "Same man," she confirmed, comparing the two images. "But why would Greta Miller have his picture in her locket?" Dr. Ellis had theories, but she wanted to review more of the audio recordings before drawing conclusions. They'd found additional tapes in the second hiding place, including what appeared to be personal messages from refugees to family members they'd been separated from. "It's possible your grandfather stayed at the station longer than most," she suggested. "Some refugees needed weeks or months to recover from their journeys before they could continue safely. The Muellers might have formed personal attachments to people who stayed with them for extended periods." That evening, Jack played the tapes again, while Toby drew pictures of the barn and the people whose voices they'd been hearing. One recording caught his attention, a conversation between Heinrich and someone whose voice sounded familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. "The construction work on the root cellar is finished," the familiar voice reported. "Should provide secure storage for documents and supplies if we need to evacuate quickly." "Excellent work, Friedrich," Heinrich replied. "Your skills have been invaluable to the operation." Jack's hand trembled as he paused the tape. Friedrich, his grandfather, hadn't just been a refugee passing through Station 7. He'd been part of the network itself, using his construction skills to help build the very hiding places that had preserved these records. The next tape confirmed it. Friedrich Carter's voice, stronger and more confident than in his refugee testimony, discussing plans to expand the barn's secret chambers and create better ventilation systems for people hiding in small spaces. "We need to think ahead," his grandfather's voice said across the decades. "This war will end someday, but there will always be people who need help, who need places to hide from hatred and fear." Jack sat in his trailer's dim kitchen, listening to his grandfather's words and feeling the weight of family legacy settling around him like a familiar coat. Fred Carter hadn't just survived persecution. He dedicated himself to helping others survive it too. Toby looked up from his drawings. "Great-Grandpa Fred helped build the hiding places? Looks like it, buddy." "That's why we found them," Toby said, with the simple certainty of childhood logic. "He wanted us to find them." Wednesday morning brought unexpected visitors. A black sedan pulled into the trailer park, and two men in business suits approached. Jack's door. They introduced themselves as representatives of a private foundation dedicated to preserving Holocaust-era materials, and they'd heard about his discovery through academic networks. "Mr. Carter," the older man said, settling into Jack's cramped living room, "we're prepared to make you a very generous offer for the complete collection of materials you've found." The younger man opened a briefcase and withdrew a contract. $100,000. Immediate payment with all rights transferred to our foundation. We have preservation facilities and exhibition spaces that could give these materials the attention they deserve. Jack looked at the contract, seeing more money than he'd ever imagined having. Enough to buy a house, pay for Toby's college education, start over completely. But something in the men's manner made him uncomfortable. They seemed more interested in acquiring the collection than in understanding its historical significance. "I need to think about it," Jack said. "Of course. But we should mention that we're not the only interested party. Word about discoveries like this travels fast in collector circles. If you wait too long, you might find yourself in a bidding war that could complicate the legal situation." After they left, Jack called Dr. Ellis. Her voice carried a note of concern when he described the visit. "Jack, be very careful. Not all collectors are interested in preserving history for education and research. Some just want to own rare items, even if it means keeping them away from scholars and the public." That afternoon, Sarah arrived unannounced, her expression a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She'd heard rumors about Jack's discovery through Toby's excited reports at school, and she wanted to see for herself what all the fuss was about. Jack showed her through the barn, explaining the hidden chambers and playing portions of the audio recordings. For once, Sarah listened without interrupting, her lawyer's mind clearly processing the historical and legal implications of what they'd found. "This is real," she said finally, examining Heinrich's journal with professional attention. "These materials have genuine historical value." "I know. So what are you planning to do with them? Because if you're thinking about keeping them in this falling-down barn, you need to consider Toby's future. This could pay for his college education. Jack, it could give him opportunities we never had." Jack watched his son playing in the barn's dusty corners, building elaborate worlds with sticks and stones and imagination. "What kind of opportunities? The kind where we sell our family's history to the highest bidder." "Your family's history. Jack, you didn't even know your grandfather was involved in this until a few days ago. You can't build Toby's future on romantic notions about people you never really knew." But that evening, as Jack tucked his son into bed, Toby asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Daddy, if we sell Great-Grandpa Fred's story, will people still remember why he helped all those families?" Jack looked into his son's earnest face and saw his grandfather's stubborn integrity reflected there. Fred Carter had used his construction skills not to get rich, but to build hiding places for people who had nowhere else to turn. He'd risked his newfound freedom to help others find theirs. "What do you think we should do, buddy?" "I think we should make sure everyone knows how brave Great-Grandpa Fred and Heinrich and Greta were, but not just rich people in museums, regular people like us." Toby's words stayed with Jack as he sat on his small porch later that night, looking out at the stars that had watched over this land when refugees found safety here. The silver locket sat on the table beside him, its small weight somehow heavier than all the contracts and offers that had accumulated over the past few days. His grandfather's photograph gazed up at him from the locket's open face. A young man who had lost everything and chosen to spend his freedom helping others find theirs. The same man who had raised Jack's father with quiet stories about the importance of helping neighbors, even when you had little to offer. Now, Jack faced his own choice. Take the money and give Toby financial security, or find another way to honor the legacy that had brought them to this barn in the first place. Either way, the decision would shape not just their future, but how the world remembered Heinrich, Greta, and Friedrich Carter. Ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. When the world needed them most, in the morning, he would have to choose. The original property deed was discovered Thursday morning, hidden in the most unlikely place, inside the wooden handle of an old pitchfork that Toby had been playing with since their first visit to the barn. Marcus, the graduate student, had been cataloguing tools when he noticed that the handle felt wrong, too light and hollow-sounding when tapped. "There's something inside this," he told Dr. Ellis, who carefully split the aged wood to reveal a metal cylinder wrapped in oiled leather. Inside the cylinder was a collection of legal documents that changed everything Jack thought he knew about his 20-cent purchase. The centerpiece was a property deed dated 1941, clearly establishing Heinrich and Greta Möller as the rightful owners of not just the barn, but 47 acres of surrounding farmland. "This complicates matters significantly," Dr. Ellis said, studying the documents with a magnifying glass. "According to these papers, the Möllers never sold their property. They were still the legal owners when they disappeared in 1945. Jack felt the solid ground beneath his feet suddenly shift. "What does that mean for us?" "It means your purchase from the county may not be legally valid. If the Möllers have living descendants, they could have a legitimate claim to the property and everything on it." The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. Not only might he lose the barn and the historical materials, but he could be liable for disturbing the hidden chambers and removing items that rightfully belonged to someone else. Dr. Ellis continued examining the documents. Among them was a will dated August 1945, just days before Heinrich and Greta disappeared. In careful legal language, they had left their property and all contents to Friedrich Carter and his descendants in recognition of his service to our cause and his commitment to preserving the memory of those we have helped. Your grandfather was their heir, Dr. Ellis said softly. They left everything to him, but there was more. A second legal document, signed by Friedrich Carter himself, donated the property to something called the Hidden Harbor Foundation, an organization dedicated to preserving the memory of wartime refugees and the networks that helped them. I've never heard of this foundation, Dr. Ellis said, pulling out her phone to begin searching databases. After several calls to historical societies and legal archives, she found the answer. The Hidden Harbor Foundation was dissolved in 1947, just 2 years after it was established. The property reverted to county ownership when no one came forward to claim it. Jack sat in the barn's dusty silence, trying to process what he'd learned. His grandfather had inherited the barn and chosen to dedicate it to preserving refugee history, but something had prevented the foundation from continuing its work, and the property had been forgotten until the county auctioned it for 20 cents. There's something else, Dr. Ellis said, examining the final document in the collection. A letter from your grandfather to Heinrich and Greta, dated September 1945. She read it aloud. My dear friends, I have established the foundation, as you requested, but I fear the political climate makes it dangerous to proceed openly. Too many people still view any German connection with suspicion, and I worry that publicizing our work would put other network members at risk. I will preserve everything as you asked, but the world may not be ready for this story yet. Perhaps someday, when hatred has cooled and wisdom has grown, someone will rediscover what we have hidden here and finish the work we started. The letter was signed, "With eternal gratitude, Friedrich Carter." Jack looked around the barn with new understanding. His grandfather hadn't just been helped by Heinrich and Greta, he'd become their partner in preserving the network's legacy. The Hidden Harbor Foundation had been his attempt to honor their work, but fear and prejudice had forced him to abandon the public mission. "Daddy," Toby said from where he'd been quietly listening, "does this mean Great-Grandpa Fred wanted us to find all this stuff?" "I think maybe he did, buddy." That afternoon brought another complication. A well-dressed woman in her 60s arrived at the barn, introducing herself as Elena Müller-Schmidt, Heinrich and Greta's great-niece. She'd driven from Colorado after hearing about the discovery through academic networks. "My great-uncle and great-aunt disappeared when I was a child," she explained, her slight accent echoing Heinrich's recorded voice. "My family always wondered what happened to them. We assumed they had died during the war." Eleanor examined the documents and recordings, with tears in her eyes. "I never knew they were doing such important work. My family, we only knew that they had immigrated to America before the war and that we lost contact with them afterward." She produced documents of her own, family photographs, immigration records, and a letter from Heinrich to his brother in Germany dated 1943, which mentioned important work that must remain secret for now. "I have no interest in claiming the property," Elena assured Jack, "but I would very much like to help preserve my relatives' legacy. They clearly meant for their work to be remembered." The legal situation remained complicated, but Dr. Ellis found a possible solution. If Elena formally renounces any claim to the property, and if we can establish clear documentation of your grandfather's inheritance and his intent to preserve the materials for historical purposes, we might be able to create a new foundation to continue the work he started. That evening, as Jack sat in his trailer reviewing the day's discoveries, Sarah called with news that added another layer of complexity to an already tangled situation. "Jack, I've been doing some research on my own. That barn and those documents, they could be worth a lot more than anyone's telling you. I've found 3 private collectors who specialize in World War II materials, and they're all interested in making offers." "Sarah!" Listen to me. We're talking about enough money to set Toby up for life. College fund, house down payment, everything we've never been able to give him. You can't let sentiment override practical responsibility. After she hung up, Jack walked outside into the October night. The stars were brilliant over the prairie, the same stars that had guided refugees to safety at Station 7. He thought about his grandfather's difficult choice in 1945, preserve the history openly and risk exposing other network members to persecution, or hide it safely and hope that someday the world would be ready to hear the story. Now Jack faced a similar choice. Take the money and secure Toby's financial future, or find a way to honor Heinrich, Greta, and Friedrich's vision of preserving refugee history for education and inspiration. The original property deed lay on his kitchen table, along with his grandfather's letter explaining his decision to hide the foundation's work until hatred has cooled and wisdom has grown. Looking at Toby's drawings of the barn and the families who had found safety there, Jack wondered if that time had finally come. Elena Müller-Schmidt had left her contact information and a promise to support whatever decision he made. The private collectors Sarah had mentioned would gladly write checks that could transform his and Toby's lives. But somewhere in the barn's hidden chambers, Heinrich and Greta's voices continued to tell stories of courage and compassion that no amount of money could buy. Jack looked at his son's sleeping face and made his decision. Tomorrow, he would call Dr. Ellis and Eleanor and begin the work of establishing a new Hidden Harbor Foundation, not for profit, but for the purpose his grandfather had originally intended. The barn would become what it was always meant to be, a place where people could learn about the courage of ordinary individuals who chose to help others when the world seemed determined to tear itself apart. It wouldn't make them rich, but it would honor the legacy they'd inherited along with 20 cents worth of hope. Heinrich's final letter was found exactly where his journal had indicated it would be, sealed in a glass jar buried beneath the barn's foundation stone. Dr. Ellis and her team excavated it carefully on Friday morning, using archaeological techniques to preserve both the container and its contents. The letter was dated August 29, 1945, written in Heinrich's careful handwriting on paper that bore the letterhead of the original Hidden Harbor Foundation that Friedrich Carter had established. To whoever finds this record of our work, if you are reading this, then God has seen fit to preserve our story through the darkness that we fear is coming. Greta and I have decided to leave this place, not because our work is finished, but because we can no longer do it safely. The war in Europe has ended, but the war in men's hearts continues. Already we hear talk of suspicion toward anyone who helped the wrong people during the conflict. Some say that those who aided refugees were traitors to America, regardless of the lives we saved or the values we upheld. We have given all our records to our dear friend Friedrich Carter, who understands better than most what it means to lose everything and start again. He will preserve what we have built here, though perhaps not in the way we originally hoped. The times require patience and wisdom more than courage now, but someday, perhaps in a generation, perhaps in 2, someone will need to remember that. Ordinary people can do extraordinary good when they choose love over fear, compassion over suspicion. That is why we have hidden these records so carefully. Not for scholars or collectors, but for future generations who must learn that heroism is not the privilege of the famous or powerful, but the responsibility of anyone who sees suffering and chooses to act. We helped 847 people find safety between 1942 and 1945. Each one had a name, a story, a family that loved them. They were not statistics or political symbols. They were human beings whose only crime was being in the wrong place when hatred ruled the world. If you have found this letter, you have also found their stories. We ask only this: remember them, not as victims but as survivors. Remember us not as heroes, but as neighbors who did what neighbors should do. And remember that the choice between compassion and cruelty comes to every generation in ways both large and small. The barn itself is not important. It is only wood and stone. But the stories it holds, the memories it preserves, the lessons it teaches, these are treasures beyond any material value. Guard them well and share them wisely. With faith in the future, Heinrich and Greta Mueller Station 7. Jack read the letter aloud to the assembled group. Dr. Ellis, Marcus, Elena Mueller-Schmidt, and Mrs. Henderson, who had insisted on being present for this moment. Even Toby sat quietly, seeming to understand the solemnity of Heinrich's words reaching across 8 decades. 847 people, Dr. Ellis whispered. We had estimated 200 based on the journal entries we'd read. But this was a major operation. Elena wiped tears from her eyes. I'm so proud of them, and so sorry I never knew them. Over the weekend, working with Elena and Dr. Ellis, Jack began the legal process of establishing the new Hidden Harbor Foundation. Elena had brought copies of family documents that helped establish the Mueller family's story, including photographs of Heinrich and Greta's wedding in 1939, and letters they'd written to relatives in Germany, describing their hopes for life in America. They came here seeking freedom, Elena explained, but they found purpose in helping others find the same thing. The new foundation would operate differently than the collectors and dealers who'd been circling the discovery like vultures. Instead of acquiring the materials for private ownership, it would preserve them in their original location, transforming the barn into an educational center where visitors could experience the history in the place where it actually happened. It won't make you rich, Dr. Ellis warned Jack. Educational foundations operate on tight budgets, and you'd be looking at a modest salary as site director. But it would be honest work, Jack replied, thinking of his grandfather's values. Work. That matters. Sarah's reaction was predictably explosive. She arrived at the barn on Sunday afternoon with papers from her lawyer and a determination to claim half the value of anything Jack might profit from his discovery. You're throwing away our son's future for some romantic fantasy about dead heroes, she said, her voice echoing in the barn's restored interior. These materials are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, Jack, maybe more, and you want to give them away to build some tourist trap in the middle of nowhere? It's not about money, Sarah. Everything's about money when you don't have any. Look at this place. Look at how you're living. Toby deserves better than a trailer park and hand-me-down clothes. He deserves college, travel, opportunities. He deserves to know his family's story, Jack interrupted. He deserves to understand that his great-grandfather was a man who chose helping others over helping himself. That's worth more than any college fund. Elena, who had been quietly examining photographs in the corner, approached Sarah with gentle diplomacy. Mrs. Carter, I understand your concerns, but perhaps we can find a middle ground. The foundation could establish an education fund for Toby, funded by visitor donations and grants. He would benefit from his family's legacy without compromising the historical mission. Sarah studied Eleanor skeptically. And what's your interest in all this? Why would a stranger from Colorado care about Jack's financial problems? Because Heinrich and Greta were my family too, and because I believe that some things are more valuable when they're shared than when they're sold. The week leading up to the planned dedication ceremony passed in a blur of activity. Word about the discovery had spread through academic networks and local media, bringing visitors who wanted to see the barn before it was officially opened to the public. Dr. Ellis coordinated with university historians to verify the authenticity of every document and recording. The results exceeded even her optimistic expectations. The materials represented the most complete record of underground railway operations ever discovered, with implications for understanding not just refugee assistance during World War II, but patterns of grassroots resistance to persecution throughout American history. This isn't just about the Holocaust, she explained to a gathering of local officials and potential foundation supporters. The techniques and networks documented here were used again during the civil rights era, and they're still being used today by groups that help refugees and asylum seekers. Heinrich and Greta's story is part of a continuous thread of American compassion. Toby had become the Barnes' unofficial junior historian, able to tell visitors about each family whose story was preserved in the recordings. He'd memorized details about David Goldman, who wanted to become a teacher, Maria and little Peter, who were traveling to safety in Canada, and his own great-grandfather Friedrich, whose construction skills had helped build the hiding places. Great-grandpa. Fred was brave, he would tell visitors with 6-year-old certainty. He lost everything, but he still helped other people not lose everything too. Mrs. Henderson had appointed herself keeper of local memories, contacting elderly residents who might remember the Mueller family or other suspicious activities from the war years. Her efforts had uncovered additional witnesses who confirmed details from Heinrich's journal, including the nighttime signals and the careful timing of refugee movements. There were rumors for years, one 90-year-old farmer told her. People said strange things happened out at the Mueller place. But everybody liked Heinrich and Greta, so nobody asked too many questions. Looking back, I think a lot of us suspected they were up to something good, even if we didn't know what. As the dedication ceremony approached, Jack found himself fighting. A mixture of excitement and nervousness. The local newspaper wanted to interview him about the discovery. A television station from Oklahoma City was planning to cover the event. University researchers were requesting access to the materials for ongoing studies. All the attention felt overwhelming for a man who'd spent the past year trying to become invisible, hiding from creditors and disappointment in a trailer park, where nobody asked difficult questions. But every time he considered backing away from the public commitment, he remembered Heinrich's final letter and his grandfather's quiet dedication to preserving their story. On the night before the ceremony, Jack sat with Toby on the barn's front step, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. The building hummed with subtle activity, climate control systems installed to preserve the documents, security equipment to protect the collection, and lighting that would allow visitors to experience the space safely while respecting its historical integrity. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Toby asked, leaning against his father's shoulder. "A little, are you?" "No, I think Great-Grandpa Fred and Heinrich and Greta would be happy that people are finally going to hear their stories." Jack smiled, struck once again by his son's simple wisdom. "I think you're right, buddy. Tomorrow would bring journalists and historians, local officials and distant relatives, curiosity seekers and serious students of history. The barn that had been forgotten for 75 years would become a place of learning and remembrance. And Jack Carter, who had bought hope for 20 cents, would finally understand what his grandfather had tried to preserve in the darkness between one generation and the next. The stories were ready to be told. The bronze memorial plaque gleamed in the October morning sunshine, its polished surface reflecting the faces of nearly 200 people who had gathered for the Hidden Harbor Foundation's dedication ceremony. Jack had been awake since dawn, checking and rechecking the arrangements, but now that the moment had arrived, he felt a strange calm settling over him. The plaque itself was Elena's contribution to the memorial, cast by a craftsman in Colorado who specialized in historical markers. Its text was simple and powerful. Station 7, Hidden Harbor, 1942 to 1945. In memory of Heinrich and Greta Mueller, and all who risked everything to help strangers find safety, including Friedrich Carter and the 847 refugees who passed through this place when the world forgot that compassion is the highest form of courage. Remember us not as heroes, but as neighbors who did what neighbors should do. Heinrich Mueller, 1945, dedicated by the Hidden Harbor Foundation, October 2024. Dr. Ellis had organized the ceremony with the precision of an academic conference, but the tone was more like a family reunion. Elderly residents sat in folding chairs beside young historians with notebooks, Holocaust survivors who had driven from distant cities mingled with local farmers who remembered hearing whispered stories about the Mueller place. Jack stood beside the memorial plaque, Toby's small hand warm in his, and looked out at the assembled crowd. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, wearing her best dress and the satisfied expression of someone who had finally seen old mysteries resolved. Sarah had surprised everyone by attending, though she sat in the back with her arms crossed and a skeptical expression. Elena Müller-Schmidt served as master of ceremonies, her voice carrying clearly across the prairie as she introduced the historical significance of Station 7 and the network it had been part of. She had brought a delegation of family members from Colorado, distant cousins who carried photographs of Heinrich and Greta and stories passed down through generations. My great-uncle and great-aunt came to America seeking a better life, Eleanor said, her accent faint but detectable. They found something more valuable than prosperity. They found purpose. In helping others escape persecution, they discovered who they were meant to be. Dr. Ellis spoke next, placing the discovery in its historical context and explaining the ongoing research that would grow from the preserved materials. These documents and recordings represent more than historical curiosity, she said. They're proof that ordinary people working together can stand against the worst impulses of their times. When Jack's turn came to speak, he felt his throat tighten with emotion. The words he'd prepared seemed inadequate for the moment, but Toby squeezed his hand encouragingly, and he found his voice. 3 weeks ago, I bought this barn for 20 cents because I was broke and desperate and wanted to give my son something that felt like hope, he began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. I thought I was buying a shelter. Instead, I discovered that my grandfather and I are part of a story that stretches back 75 years and forward into whatever future we choose to build. He paused, looking at the faces before him. Young and old, skeptical and believing, all united by their presence at this unlikely memorial in the middle of nowhere. Heinrich Müller wrote that heroism isn't the privilege of the famous or powerful, but the responsibility of anyone who sees suffering and chooses to act. My grandfather, Friedrich Carter, understood that. He lost everything, his farm, his freedom, his confidence in the country he'd adopted as his own, but he still chose to help build hiding places for other people's hope. Jack's voice grew stronger as he continued. We're not here today to celebrate the past. We're here to remember that the choice between compassion and cruelty comes to every generation, in ways both large and small. Heinrich and Greta and my grandfather, they made their choice. Now we have to make ours. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of the memorial plaque, followed by tours of the barn and the preserved hidden chambers. Visitors listened to selected audio recordings through headphones, experiencing the voices of refugees who had found safety at Station 7. Many emerged from the barn with tears in their eyes, having encountered history not as abstract facts, but as intimate human experiences. One visitor particularly moved Jack, an elderly man named Samuel Goldstein, who had driven from Chicago after hearing about the ceremony on public radio. He examined the photographs and documents with the intensity of someone searching for familiar faces. I was 10 years old when my family came through a place like this, he told Jack. Different state, different helpers, but the same kind of courage. We never learned the names of the people who saved us. They kept their secret to protect us and themselves. Samuel studied the memorial plaque for a long time before speaking again. This is important work you're doing, making sure people remember that America has always had two faces, one that fears strangers and one that welcomes them. Most of the time, it's ordinary people who decide which face the world sees. As the afternoon wore on and visitors began to leave, Jack found himself in conversation with a journalist from the Oklahoma City newspaper. The reporter was interested in the human interest angle, the single father who had discovered his family's heroic past. But Jack tried to steer. the conversation back to the historical significance. "This isn't about me," he insisted. "It's about making sure Heinrich and Greta's story gets told, and that people understand the network they were part of still exists in different forms today." The journalist, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a recorder app on her phone, pressed him about his decision to create a foundation rather than sell the materials. "You could have made enough money to change your life completely. Instead, you're choosing to work for a non-profit that may struggle to pay its bills. Some people would call that foolish." Jack looked across the prairie toward his trailer, where he and Toby would return that evening to their modest life, then back at the barn, where visitors were still listening to voices from 1943. "Some people would be wrong," he said simply. "There are more important things than money." As sunset approached and the last visitors departed, the core group, Jack, Toby, Elena, Dr. Ellis, and Mrs. Henderson, gathered around the memorial plaque for a quiet moment of reflection. The bronze surface caught the golden light, making the engraved words seem to glow with their own inner fire. "They would be proud," Elena said softly, touching the names of her great-aunt and great-uncle. "All of them would be proud," Mrs. Henderson added, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived long enough to see history from both sides. As they prepared to close the barn for the day, Toby asked the question that had been building throughout the ceremony. "Daddy, what happens now?" Jack looked at his son, at the memorial that would preserve their family's story for future generations, and at the barn that had somehow survived decades of neglect to give up its secrets at exactly the right moment. "Now we do the work," he said. "We make sure people keep learning about Heinrich and Greta and great-grandpa Fred. We keep telling their story until everyone understands that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to help." Instead of harm, the dedication ceremony was over, but Jack knew that the real work was just beginning. The children's book began as Toby's idea, born from his 6-year-old frustration that none of his classmates understood what made the barn so special. 2 weeks after the dedication ceremony, he approached his father with a stack of drawings and a simple request. "I want to make a book about great-grandpa Fred and Heinrich and Greta," he announced, spreading his artwork across the kitchen table. "So kids can understand why they were brave." The drawings were remarkable for a child's work, simple but emotionally resonant illustrations of families finding shelter, of Heinrich and Greta sharing meals with strangers, of his great-grandfather building secret hiding places with his carpenter's tools. In Toby's artistic vision, the barn glowed with warm light, a beacon of safety in a dark world. Jack had been working with Eleanor and Dr. Ellis to establish the Foundation's educational programs, but Toby's book project captured something that academic papers and historical analyses couldn't: the essential humanity of the story. Working together, father and son crafted a narrative that explained the refugee network in terms a child could understand without diminishing its historical importance. "Once upon a time," their story began, "there was a barn that looked ordinary from the outside, but inside it held the most extraordinary secret of all. It was full of love for strangers." The local newspaper had run several follow-up articles about the Hidden Harbor Foundation, bringing visitors from across the state and beyond. School groups began requesting tours, and Jack found himself becoming comfortable in the role of educator and storyteller. Each group of visitors brought new perspectives on the historical materials, and he learned as much from their questions as they did from his presentations. Sarah's attitude had gradually shifted from skepticism to grudging respect as she watched Jack's transformation from desperate unemployment to meaningful work. The Foundation's modest salary wasn't enough to make him wealthy, but grants and donations were providing stability he hadn't experienced in years. "You seem different," she observed during one of her visits to pick up Toby for the weekend. "More settled, more like the man I married." The legal complications surrounding the property had been resolved through Eleanor's formal renunciation of any claim and the establishment of clear documentation showing Friedrich Carter's inheritance and intentions. The Hidden Harbor Foundation now held secure title to the barn and its contents, with Jack serving as executive director and site coordinator. More importantly, the partnership with Elena had evolved into a genuine friendship based on shared commitment to preserving their family's legacy. She visited monthly from Colorado, bringing additional family documents and stories that helped flesh out Heinrich and Greta's background. They were teachers in Germany, she revealed during one visit, showing Jack photographs she'd discovered in her grandmother's papers. Heinrich taught mathematics, and Greta taught literature. They came to America not just to escape the rising tensions, but because they believed in American ideals of freedom and equality. This information recontextualized everything they'd learned about Station 7's operations. Heinrich and Greta hadn't stumbled into refugee assistance. They'd applied their teaching skills to the work of education and protection, treating each person who passed through their barn as a student in a course on survival and hope. The audio recordings had been professionally digitized and were now available for researchers worldwide, leading to new discoveries about the underground network's scope and effectiveness. Universities were incorporating the materials into courses on Holocaust studies, American history, and human rights education. Dr. Ellis had received a grant to establish a formal research center based on the Hidden Harbor collection, bringing graduate students and visiting scholars to the barn for extended study. The combination of academic research and public education was creating exactly the kind of living memorial that Heinrich's final letter had envisioned. Mrs. Henderson had become the Foundation's unofficial historian, collecting oral histories from elderly residents who remembered the wartime era. Her interviews were revealing details about community attitudes and hidden support networks that hadn't appeared in any official documents. People knew more than they let on, she explained to Jack. There was an understanding that some things didn't get talked about, but that didn't mean they weren't noticed or appreciated. The Mullers had more help than they probably realized. As winter approached, Jack and Toby had moved from the trailer park into a small house adjacent to the barn property, modest but comfortable, with room for Toby to grow and space for Jack to continue his work with the foundation. The house had come with the property purchase, another surprise hidden in the legal documents Elena had helped uncover. Great-Grandpa Fred thought of everything, Toby observed, as they unpacked boxes in their new home. He knew someday we'd need a place to live while we took care of his barn. The children's book was nearing completion, with a local artist helping to refine Toby's illustrations and a small press expressing interest in publication. All proceeds would benefit the Hidden Harbor Foundation's educational programs, ensuring that future generations of children could learn about courage and compassion through age-appropriate storytelling. On a quiet December evening, as snow began to fall across the Oklahoma prairie, Jack sat with his son at their new kitchen table, reviewing the final draft of their book. The words were simple but powerful. The barn taught everyone who visited that home isn't just a place where you live, it's a place where you're safe to be yourself. Heinrich and Greta and Great-Grandpa Fred made sure that feeling of home could travel from person to person, family to family, until it reached all the way across America and beyond. Toby looked up from the manuscript with satisfaction. I think kids will understand now. It's not about being famous or rich. It's about sharing what you have, even when you don't have very much. Jack nodded, thinking about how far they'd come from that desperate October day when 20 cents represented his last hope. The barn had given them much more than shelter. It had connected them to a legacy of service and compassion that would continue growing long after they were gone. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the prairie with the same gentle silence that had blessed refugees finding safety at Station 7 nearly 80 years earlier. The barn stood ready for tomorrow's visitors, its stories preserved, and its lessons waiting to inspire new generations of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary good. 1 year later, Jack stood in the workshop behind their house, putting the finishing touches on a wooden toy truck he'd been carving for Toby's 8th birthday. The wood was smooth under his hands, shaped by the same tools his grandfather had used to build secret chambers and hidden doors. But this truck was destined for play, not preservation, a symbol of childhood joy that could weather any storm. The Hidden Harbour Foundation had exceeded everyone's expectations in its first year of operation. More than 3,000 visitors had toured the barn, including school groups, historical societies, and tourists who had heard about the discovery through national media coverage. The children's book that Jack and Toby had written together was in its second printing, with translations planned for German and Spanish editions. "Daddy! Mrs. Chen's class is here," Toby called from the back door, interrupting Jack's work on the truck. At 7 years old, Toby had become the barn's most enthusiastic junior guide, capable of leading age-appropriate tours that helped other children understand the historical significance without overwhelming them with adult complexities. Jack set down his carving tools and walked toward the barn, where a group of third graders was gathered around the memorial plaque. Mrs. Chen, a teacher from the Oklahoma City area, had brought her students for their unit on American heroes, and Toby was explaining how ordinary people had done extraordinary things during World War II. "My great-grandpa Fred lost his farm and got put in jail even though he didn't do anything wrong," Toby was saying, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had told this story dozens of times. But when Heinrich and Greta needed help building hiding places for families, he used his carpenter tools to make them safe. One of the students raised her hand. Why did the families need to hide? Because some people were being mean to them, just because they were different, Toby explained with 7-year-old clarity. But Heinrich and Greta and great-grandpa Fred believed that being different isn't a reason to be mean to someone. Jack smiled, listening to his son navigate complex historical and moral questions with the wisdom of a child who had grown up surrounded by stories of courage and compassion. The boy understood intuitively what some adults struggled to grasp, that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or famous deeds, but about small acts of kindness multiplied across time and space. Elena Mueller-Schmidt had driven down from Colorado for the anniversary celebration, bringing with her a surprise that had taken months of genealogical research to arrange. She'd managed to locate 3 survivors who had passed through Station 7 as children, now elderly, but eager to see the place that had saved their families. The reunion took place in the barn's main room, where David Goldstein, now Dr. David Goldstein, retired professor of education, stood looking at a photograph of himself as a 12-year-old boy. "I remember this picture," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Mueller, Greta, she insisted on taking photographs because she said someday people would need proof that we were real, that we mattered." Beside him stood Maria Santos, whose maiden name had been Kowalski when she'd traveled through Station 7 as a pregnant young woman in 1944. "I gave birth to my son 3 weeks after leaving here," she told Jack. "We named him Heinrich, after Mr. Mueller. He became a doctor and saved thousands of lives. The kindness they showed us kept multiplying through the generations." The third survivor, Ruth Miller, had been only 4 years old when her family found shelter at the barn. Her memories were fragmentary but emotionally vivid. "I remember feeling safe for the first time in months. There was a woman, Greta, who sang German lullabies while she brushed my hair. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the love." Jack watched Toby listening to these testimonies with rapt attention, his young mind processing the connection between the historical documents they'd been preserving and the living. People whose lives had been touched by his great-grandfather's work. Dr. Ellis had arrived with a film crew from the State University, documenting the survivor testimonies for the Foundation's archives. The combination of wartime recordings and contemporary interviews was creating a unique historical resource that showed how acts of courage rippled across decades. This is what Heinrich meant when he wrote about preserving stories for future generations, Dr. Ellis observed as she watched David Goldstein explain to Toby how the boy's great-grandfather had taught him basic carpentry skills during his 3-week stay at Station 7. The past and present are having a conversation here, and the future is listening. Sarah had surprised everyone by taking an active interest in the Foundation's work, using her legal skills to help navigate grant applications and compliance requirements. Her relationship with Jack remained complicated, but she'd developed genuine respect for what he'd accomplished. "You found your calling," she told him during a quiet moment between anniversary events. "I wasn't sure you ever would, but you did." The barn itself had been carefully restored to balance historical preservation with modern safety requirements. Visitors could experience the hidden chambers much as Heinrich and Greta's guests had, but with proper lighting, ventilation, and accessibility features that allowed people of all ages and abilities to participate in the tours. Mrs. Henderson, now 79 and moving more slowly, but still sharp as ever, had appointed herself keeper of the visitor book, where people wrote their reflections after touring the barn. The entries ranged from simple expressions of gratitude to profound meditations on moral courage, but they shared a common theme: recognition that ordinary individuals could make extraordinary differences in the lives of strangers. As evening approached and the anniversary celebration wound down, Jack found himself alone in the barn with Toby, surrounded by the comfortable silence that had become familiar over the past year. The boy was arranging the historical photographs in their display cases, a responsibility he'd taken seriously since the Foundation's opening. "Daddy," Toby said thoughtfully, "do you think Great-Grandpa Fred knew we'd find all this stuff when he hid it?" Jack considered the question, thinking about his grandfather's careful preservation of materials that could have gotten him in serious trouble if discovered at the wrong time. "I think he hoped someone in our family would find it someday, when the world was ready to hear the story, and we were the right someones." "Yeah, buddy, we were the right someones." They walked home through the soft darkness of the October evening, past the memorial plaque that gleamed faintly in the starlight. The house that had come with the property felt genuinely like home now, filled with the accumulated comfort of a year spent doing work that mattered. In his workshop, Jack returned to the wooden truck he'd been carving, adding final details by lamplight. This toy would be different from the first one he'd made for Toby, more sophisticated in its construction, reflecting skills he'd developed while learning about his grandfather's carpentry work. But its purpose remained the same: to provide joy and comfort to a child whose world was built on love and stability. As he worked, Jack reflected on the journey that had brought them from a 20-cent purchase to a nationally recognized historical site. The barn had given them far more than financial security. It had connected them to a legacy of service that would continue growing long after they were gone. Visitors often asked Jack if he ever regretted not selling the materials to private collectors for the substantial sums he'd been offered. His answer was always the same: some things were more valuable when shared than when owned, and stories of courage needed to be told openly rather than hidden away in private collections. Toby appeared in the workshop doorway, ready for bed but reluctant to end a day that had been filled with meaningful connections to the past. "The truck looks good, Daddy. Can I play with it tomorrow?" "That's what it's for," Jack said, setting down his carving tools and preparing to tuck his son into bed. "Trucks are meant to carry things from one place to another. This one's going to carry your imagination wherever you want to go." As they walked toward the house, Toby asked one final question. "Do you think Heinrich and Greta and Great-Grandpa Fred would be proud of what we're doing with their barn?" Jack looked back at the barn, its silhouette visible against the star-filled sky, and thought about all the visitors who had stood in those hidden chambers and emerged with new understanding of what courage looked like in everyday life. "I think They'd be proud that their story is finally being told, he said. And I think they'd be especially proud that it's helping people understand that anyone can choose to help instead of harm, to welcome instead of fear, to build instead of destroy. The wooden truck was finished, smooth and solid in Jack's hands, a toy that would provide years of joy while carrying forward the legacy of a man who had chosen compassion over comfort, service over safety, and hope over despair. In the morning, it would become part of Toby's world, another thread in the continuing story of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary good. The barn held its secrets no longer, but it had gained something more valuable, the power to inspire. New generations of heroes who would never see their names on memorial plaques, but would sleep peacefully, knowing they had helped strangers find safety in an uncertain world.